Thanks everyone for joining us for tonight's special event. We are so excited to welcome Pamela Paul in conversation with Ayad Akhtar. My name is Kevin. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. And before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. And if you don't already do so, please follow us on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and our YouTube page. Tonight's event is being brought to you in partnership with our friends Third Place Books up in Seattle. You can find out more about them at thirdplacebooks.com. Spencer Ruckty is the events coordinator there, and he's here to tell you a little bit more about tonight's special event. Spencer?
Hey, thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you to the Powell's events team, and thank you in particular to Pamela and Ayad for joining us tonight. My name is Spencer Ruckty. As Kevin said, I'm the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. I am here to remind you that this evening's event will include some time for your questions. So if you have questions for our authors tonight, you can submit those to the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. As well, if someone has typed a question that you'd love to know the answer to, you can give that question a thumbs up. We call that an upvote sometimes, and that'll bring the question to the attention of our moderators for the evening. Most importantly, please consider supporting Pamela, Third Place Books, and Powell's tonight by purchasing a copy of Pamela's new book, 100 Things We've Lost to the Internet. Links to buy the book, along with links to Ayad's books, will be shared in the chat a couple of times tonight. Please feel free to patronize whichever bookseller is closer to your home and support your local independent bookstore. And now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Pamela Paul is the editor of the New York Times Book Review and oversees books coverage at the Times. She is also the host of the weekly book review podcast, which has delightful coverage each week. If you haven't given it a listen yet, please, I encourage you to go do so. Pamela is the author of 8 books, including, but certainly not limited to, My Life with Bob and How to Raise a Reader, as well as Rectangle Time, a book for children, co-written with Maria Rousseau. Prior to joining the Times, she was a contributor to Time Magazine and The Economist, and her work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Slate, and Vogue. Pamela is joined in conversation tonight by Ayad Akhtar, a playwright, novelist, and winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His most recent book is Homeland Elegies, which was a finalist for the 2021 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction, and also one of Barack Obama's favorite books of the year in 2020. As a playwright, he has written the dramas Junk, Disgraced, and more, and he is also the recipient of the Steinberg Playwriting Award, the Nestroy Award, the Erwin Piscator Award, as well as fellowships from the American Academy in Rome, MacDowell, and Yaddo. Tonight, these two are here to talk about 100 Things We've Lost to the Internet, which is a delightful and comical catalog of beloved objects and cherished ideas from the pre-internet age, which include the phone in the kitchen, the blind date, private humiliation, your attention span, and my personal favorite, figuring out who that actor is. And with that, let's get started. Pamela, Ayad, we're thrilled to welcome you both tonight. Please join me in welcoming these two to the screen.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Spencer. Hi, Pamela.
Hey.
I'm so delighted to be doing this. I loved your book. You know, I wasn't sure whether I was going to say this, but I feel inspired by Spencer's introduction, pairing delight and comedy in describing your book. I also found it very profound, and it struck me as if Nora Ephron were writing a Yuval Harari book, or if Yuval Harari were writing a Nora Ephron book, that we would be somewhat adjacent to. We'd be in the same zip code of the book that you've written, which is very rich. I want to begin with a quote that you have at the top of the book from Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police, just to kind of set the tone for the conversation we're going to have. One morning, you'll simply wake up and it will be over before you've even realized. Lying still, eyes closed, ears pricked, trying to sense the flow of the morning air, you'll feel that something has changed from the night before, and you'll know that you've lost something. Something has been disappeared. It's a very evocative way to begin this book, which I found immersive, in part because it's so entertaining, but also because I found myself absorbed in the re-experiencing of things I was no longer experiencing in my life. And I was immersed in the felt textures of what we'd lost. You were able to capture the detail of the practices and the sort of habits and routines of life before this time. The book was a lot like an active kind of remembering. I'm in a sense, it's a kind of archaeology of the near present, oddly, and not a material inventory, but a spiritual one. Tell me how you got interested in this idea, the idea to do this. It's a very rigorous book, actually, delight aside.
And I'm hiring you to write all my blurbs from now on, because that was so kind. But it's funny you should say that Yuval Harari meets Nora Ephron, because I will tell you that actually the epigraph was meant to be two-part. And so the Yoko Ogawa, and that's an amazing novel if you haven't read it, The Memory Police was recently translated from the Japanese into English in the last few years. That's the Harari quote. And the Nora Ephron quote, which I couldn't afford the rights to, in all honesty, but I can recite it here and attribute it to Shel Silverstein. And it's one of my favorite poems from childhood, which is called Peckin'. And it goes, "The saddest thing I ever did see was a woodpecker pecking at a plastic tree. He looks at me and friend, says he, things ain't as sweet as they used to be." And that's kind of informs my worldview, I guess, and some of the perspective of this book, because it's interesting. In a consumer society, right, we're constantly being sold goods and services. And I think, informed people like to think of themselves as skeptical consumers. So you will read the claims of a skincare product or a new exercise regime or a new cleaning service or a different cut of jeans. And you'll be like, tempted, you'll listen, and then you'll be like, you know what? I don't actually need that. I don't really believe it. But with technology, right, we tend to think that if we don't adopt the next thing, if we don't say yes, that the marketing message, and not surprisingly, because big tech is very, very good at what it does, and the internet is generally, the marketing message is that something is like really defective about our own judgment, and that we're a Luddite, or we're dragging our feet, or we're resistant to change, and we can't be with the times, and that somehow opting out of something is really seen as a poor reflection, instead of just another consumer decision. Like, I'm going to get that, or I'm not going to get that. Like, I can start paying for everything with Zelly and Venmo, or I could just write a check, which is like the most ancient thing to do. Like, when was the last time?
It's one of your chapters.
It's one of my chapters. Yeah. I mean, when was the last time someone whipped out a check? I remember working in a bookstore when I was in high school, and it was a B. Dalton. We didn't have a fun and exciting local bookstore in my town, like Powell's, our third place. But having someone come and pay with a check was like gold. Like, that was a solid way to pay, because you could not get a checkbook unless you were like considered like a functioning a sort of financially functioning individual, whereas a credit card was totally suspect. And you had to go through, like, I don't know if you worked in a store, but you had these huge bulky books of like stolen credit cards, and you'd have to look through the fine print and like look up the number to make sure that the person hadn't stolen it. So it's interesting, like, to think back to those moments. I did answer your question, which was, how did I come up with this?
No, but it reminded me that I did work at a Sam Ash music store, and that I remember it was one of my first jobs. And yes, we had to look through those catalogs. I had totally forgotten about those catalogs.
Yeah, well, so like, our memories are short, our memories are gone. That's one of the things that's gone. So is our attention span. And so what I wanted to do originally, I sort of was like, there are all these things, these ways in which internet culture and consumer culture and the way we live our lives are intersecting. And I'd been writing about it back, especially when I was writing before I was a full-time editor, stories about that intersection. And in some of my earlier books kind of looked at consumer culture and the way we live now. And I was thinking about all the things that upset me or depressed me or infuriated me about that. But what I got to eventually was, I felt like we're always, and when we think about technology, looking at like, where are we right now and where's it going to be 5 minutes from now, right? Because everything is changing so quickly and we're all just struggling to keep up. And sometimes we'll pause and be like, when did it get this way? How did it get this way? I wanted to scroll back just a few steps earlier, like to what you said, like basically like the distant past. Like, how did we actually do this all before? What did we do? And what's funny is how ancient it all seems, even though it's really just happened in the span of 20 years. But when you think about it, like, do you remember you used to go to someone's house, like you would be staying with your in-laws and you would say, like, how do I get to this restaurant? And someone, your mother-in-law would break out a pen and like painstakingly write down the directions step by step. And they would have their own code of like left turn here and this and that. And then you had to take this piece of paper and put it on like the passenger seat and balance it there and hope it didn't fly around the car. And that's how you got places, right? And now, of course, who does that? We don't need to do that. We all have GPS.
Or the map. I mean, I remember in early 2000s going out to Los Angeles and buying one of those huge book maps of all the LA county, like all the LA streets, and because there was no way to get around if you didn't have a map.
Yeah, and you would have those fold up Rand McNally maps, or those Thomas Cook maps, and you never, I mean, even after opening it once, there was no way to fold it back the way it came. Like, it was technically impossible. So you always had these like misfolded ones that'd be stuffed in the door of the car, and would be like old and ripped and frayed. And so it was just kind of thinking back, like, what was the texture of our lives before this? And what's crazy is, again, how recent this all was, but how long ago it feels.
Yeah, no, it's true. Early in the book, you talk about not wanting to take the Luddite position, not wanting to sort of, cast aspersions on the changes in the present and the way that we live now. And I think you do a fairly good job of that. How were you able, because the precision and quality of your insights around some of these things is sharp enough that I can only imagine it was fueled by a sense of either critique or anger or confusion or disorientation around what we're losing. And it is a running theme around it. How did you manage that balance of not being chastising, if you will, about the present, but at the same time pointing us to what we have lost in ways that feel important?
Well, some of those are my core emotions. So like, that was definitely my starting place. But I really did try to, first of all, not just write this 100% from my perspective, because the internet and our experience online is different from one individual to another. And it's different for people like oldsters like me, and you're slightly less old, but maybe only slightly, but people like us, and then people who are maybe much younger, and then interestingly, people who are older. I wanted to think about when was the point of entry into the internet life as a kind of deciding factor, maybe even more so than the old, generational definitions of like boomer and Gen X and millennial. And I wanted to think about, like, I'll give you a few examples of things that really don't affect me, like fantasy baseball or fantasy football or fantasy basketball, like whatever those things are, because I am not a sporty person. But that was really important to a lot of people. And there were all these rituals around it. You would like get your local paper and you would look up the sports scores, and someone would be like designated with tabulating all this stuff and like sending it around to people. And I'm sure there are people who can correct my details here, but there were all kinds of arcane rituals around it. And now it's gone. Like, you could do it online apparently, but it's sort of lost some of the kind of process and magic and serendipity of it, as I understand it. And I wanted to include those things too. And to also think about, what does this look like for a young child? What does this look like for someone who's a teenager? Because everyone is using the internet in such different ways. And then also, like, what does it look like? So there are certain things, I'll give you an example. One of the things we've lost is the sense of being the only one, right? You could be like, I am the only one who needle points, images of 19th century dolls and then like applies them to windows. And you'd be like, that's just my weird thing. That's my craft. But if you Google it, you'd probably find like there are like 38 people at least who also do that. And they've been doing it longer, and they do it better, and they do it more often, and they're more dedicated. You're never the only one. And so it makes us all feel a little bit less unique. And that can be negative, but it can also be really positive. So if you are a kid who is, it feels in some way alienated from the people around you. Let's say you are contemplating your sexual preference and you live in a small rural community and in a family that's very conservative and not accepting of that. And you are sort of given the message that, this is not okay. And you sort of feel like you're the only one. Well, then you go online and you can immediately find communities of people who have been through and are going through the exact same thing. And you can exchange, notes and feelings about that and get support. And so that's a good thing. So I just wanted to be careful to kind of turn everything around and think, well, this is a bad thing in some ways. It's also kind of a good thing. So for me, for example, I am not a huge fan of screen reading. I don't read my books on devices, but for older people who need to enlarge their letters, it's very useful. For people who have, difficulties reading, whether it's dyslexia or kids on the spectrum, often doing things on screen is really helpful. And so the internet in a lot of ways is really useful. So I tried not to have it just completely come from my, very individual, often grumpy perspective.
We'll come back to the screen versus page dichotomy because it's a running theme through the book that obviously, given the fact that you are the editor of the New York Times Book Review and that there's something very poignant about that. Your first section is about boredom, which it's called Boredom, the first chapter, and then you anatomize it delightfully. The section ends, oddly enough, with a kind of defense of boredom, that it's when, quote, small observations emerge and coalesce into ideas. You have to turn off the input in order to generate the output. Can you say more about this idea of turning off the input?
Yeah, I mean, like when you have incoming information, entertainment, distraction, right? You're just processing all of that. It's all coming in. You're not generating things. And I don't know how you work as a writer, but for me, first of all, I have this really busy day job and I have 3 full-time children and I don't have a lot of time to myself. So my writing is kind of it's pushed into the margins of my day. And the times I find when I actually have creative ideas are when I'm in the shower and then I'll be like, God damn it, I'll try to finish up really quickly so I can get out and write it down before I forget it. Because of course our memories are one of the things that we've lost to the internet. Or it's as I'm dozing off to sleep because again, my mind is like shutting down and there's nothing coming in. And I've learned now finally, after a long period of time to keep like a pen and a pad of paper by the bed so that I can write them down, because no matter how many times I say to myself, like, you will remember in the morning, you're going to repeat it 20 times, it's gone by the next day. So I think that we have lost those moments. We've lost that empty space, that time. Like I think of the hours I've spent sitting in the way back or the back seat of my parents' car, like especially if my brothers and I weren't on speaking terms, you just stared out the window. You would just like your eyes would go in between the little dashes on the, and you didn't have anything to do. Like now, when you're in the car, probably if you have kids or other family members, everybody's on a device. Like you have access to audiobooks, to podcasts, to video games, to social media. Like, you can be in a car and everyone is busy, busy, busy. And so they don't have that empty time, that contemplative time. And I do think that that's a loss. I think it's kind of good to be bored. I think for kids, and this chapter actually came out of an op-ed that I wrote for the Times, and the title in the Times was "Let Children Get Bored Again." My working title in my brain was "The Lost Art of Boredom," but the idea was really the same, which is that it's important for kids to be a little bored sometimes because, first of all, it's good to build up your reserves and to kind of overcome the frustration and annoyance of boredom. But that's also, again, where creativity stems. I don't know about you. Like, what do you find the same thing? Like, when you're bored,
no, 100%. I mean, it's always a surprise to me that it's the moments when I am forced to unplug completely. And often for long periods of time, I'll be traveling and I won't have access to the usual kinds of stimuli. And I find myself in this empty space, which is both uncomfortable, but somehow restful. That's when all of the major ideas I've had in my career, they have all come from the same sense of lying fallow. And I've never been able to manufacture that for myself because I am kind of an extrovert and I kind of get a lot of energy from being out in the world and sort of interacting with folks. And I think that I need to be forced into that kind of posture. And hearing you talk about boredom, I'm reminded of a thought that I've had about the 19th century novel in England and the rise of a leisure class where there was so much more time for leisure and so much more time for boredom that generated this kind of passion for novels, but also the empty space in which writers could think and create novels.
Yeah.
I think it's spot on. I think it's spot
I mean,
on.
it's funny. Sometimes people will say, like, what was your favorite, what's your favorite job? And one of my favorite jobs as a teenager and in college was working at a supermarket checkout, because it is kind of stultifying, right? And it's pretty boring. There are some challenges, like at least there were at that time, like memorizing the vegetable codes, things that now it's all computerized and it does for you. But you would end up, again, sort of short of stimuli, looking at what someone was buying, looking at the person who was buying it and coming up with like a creative story around it. Like, why is this, this elderly gentleman here at 9 p.m. buying like Tampax and broccoli? Like, what was the impulse item? What was the thing and for whom, so you kind of would come up with these stories, but that's what you do when you're kind of involved in these kind of rote activities. And the other thing I want to say about this is, and this sounds really basic, but I think we forget, like this book is about 100 things we've lost to the internet. And we often say like, well, it's because we have our phone on us all the time. And like, phone is such a misnomer, right? It's not a phone, it's the internet. That's what we have. We have a portable internet on us.
Right. Connected to this thought of this idea of emptiness or the fallow, and maybe somewhat in the Yuval Harari register as opposed to the Nora Ephron register. I was thinking a lot about Robert Frost in reading your book, and particularly about one of my favorite poems of his called Directive, in which there's that amazing line about finding a guide who has at heart your getting lost. And getting lost is one of your chapters, but I think it's a larger theme in the book, what not knowing can lead to. Could you say more? I mean, it's in a way I'm asking you to develop the thought about boredom, but sort of take it in a different direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you, I love to travel, and I like the discomfort of travel on many levels. I like the challenge of being out of your element, and part of that is being lost and really literally not knowing where you are. I'm reading this lovely memoir by Frank Rich, the former theater critic for the Times, called Ghostlight right now. And very early in the book, he describes it in one of his, I think it's his grandmother's like favorite things was to go and get lost, and to like, they would just drive off into like, some area of Virginia, but of course nobody had GPS, and then they would have to figure out their way back. But I think of, the most extreme example for me of getting lost, and I wrote about this in my Life with Bob, is that after college, I moved to northern Thailand, to a small city, and I didn't know anyone. I had no contacts there. I didn't have a job. I had no friends. I had like an army tape of language instruction that I studied before I went, so I could, ask, where is the airfield, and is it a comedy or a drama? And these really antiquated like phrases that they came up, I guess, for military of the 1950s. But I was totally disconnected, and there was no internet. It was the early 90s, and I had no phone, no cell phone, no landline. So I was completely disconnected from everyone. And so I went from the intensity that is, college in the United States, of like living among people, constant socializing, to being completely separated. And that's an experience of like truly being lost and alone and disconnected that I don't think we can recapture, because even if you say, okay, I'm going to do it, I'm going to like not bring a phone and not bring a computer, like your brain still knows, but it is there. There is an internet cafe. I could go to this place. I could go online. I could connect with anyone I want. I think back to a time during that period where I traveled by myself for 6 weeks in rural China. And like, to think about it now, especially as a parent, I'm like, I was 23, so my parents couldn't really stop me. But I just think like I was on a budget of $15 a day. No one knew where I was. Like I could have completely disappeared off the face of the earth, and my parents and my friends would never have known. And that, again, it's scary. And I don't know if I would be completely able to let go and let my own kids do it without, sort of trying to force them to stay home. But it was an incredible transformative experience, both of those things. And I don't know that we can recapture them. One of the things about the internet that I think is so makes it so hard for us to control is that just the presence of the internet affects our experience. So there've been studies that have shown that if you have dinner and you have a phone that's on the table, they do studies afterwards. They don't tell the participants who are eating these meals that it's about technology. They ask them afterwards about how they enjoyed their meal. And the people who have a phone on the table, as opposed to those whose phones are totally away and out of sight, actually enjoy their food less.
Wow. Getting back to talking about your kids and what you would let them do versus what you allowed yourself, what you yourself did. I wanted to say that a lot of the examples you use to illustrate what we've lost are drawn from your own childhood. And they're offered in contradistinction to your experience of being a mother and experiencing the childhood of your kids. And there's something very poignant about that vantage point that gives the book kind of emotional resonance. What is it like to have that dual perspective constantly and to be able to articulate it as a parent? I mean, can you say more about that?
I'm sure for my kids, it's extremely annoying. I'm like 10 times worse than my father was with, his stories about, walking to school 3 miles and playing stickball on the streets of Brooklyn and all of that. And the lack of, Novocaine for dental procedures. But I do try to keep constantly in perspective and to allow my kids to know, because, like sort of what it was like before. And partly that's why I wrote this book, because I thought, like, for people who, like us, this is very nostalgic. For people who are younger reading this is like an instruction manual to like the bygone days, the before times. And it's interesting for them to see what that world was like. And I think useful because they can make a choice too, right? As I said earlier, it's all a product. It's all a service that we can either choose to adopt or not adopt, or much of it at least. We do have some control. And so I think it's interesting to see this young digital generation brought up with this as the default, because they're opting out, right? Whereas we had the opportunity to opt in. Everything is about opting out for them. And I'll offer just one example with my kids, and it's not an internet example, it's a more basic technology, but just to give a sense of like how much has changed. And you could apply this to many things online. But I was going out to the car with my 16-year-old daughter. And like many people, I have several sets of keys and they're often misplaced. And all we had left was like that loser key that you have that like doesn't have the remote fob on it. It's just a key to like a little circle chain. And I brought it out with me because I couldn't find the others. And I opened up the car door with the key. And my daughter was just dumbfounded. She said, "You can open up a car with a key?" Like it didn't occur to her. But that's like a lot of pre-internet things. Like kids really don't know what it used to be like. I mean, listening to music, for example, with a teenager is really interesting because often they are so used to getting exactly the song they want at exactly the moment they want, right? They don't have to wait around on the radio like for like the Blondie song you really like to come on and like potentially wait for hours or sit watching MTV, like just being like, all I want to see is this one David Bowie video and then I'll be good. And you can be there like all day and not be sated. But they are used to getting to choose everything at any given moment, and they don't wait. So my daughter, for example, will often listen to like the first 2/3 of a song, and then she'll be like, boop, and forward it to the next thing. She's like, yeah, it's all kind of the same thing after that. And I'm like, oh my God, like, I just can't imagine what you would have made of, like in 7th grade, you would get a new album and you'd be like, this is it. And you would go and you'd put it like on your, parents' turntable. And the idea of like getting up and moving the needle and like actually trying to get into it, like you just didn't do that. You listened to that whole right. And then you flipped it over and like, we just had this kind of patience and this, and again, like, just thinking about music and the way we appreciate music, that's really different. So like, an album used to be something that really was curated as a kind of artistic whole. It was like a novel, like, they thought about like which songs went where and what was on the A side and what was on the B side and kind of how it was all arranged and how it was packaged and the things you used to get in it, right? Like, remember you would, some of them have like a pullout and you open it up and you'd have all these notes and photos and look at the lyrics and that's just all gone. Now it is all online, right? You can access it, but it's not the same experience.
But I think that's one of the things that I found about reading your book was the process of the routine or the process of the habit or the process of how we used to go about something because of the way that it was made or because of how we had access to it or what was the most convenient way through that forced us to process it or experience it in a particular way. One of the major themes of the book is relationship, whether it's the flight from conversation, to quote Sherry Turkle, which you do early in the book, to the flight from eye contact, and how relationship is changing because of the technology. Could you say more about that? And by the way, I want to remind everybody if you have questions for Pamela, please put them in the Q&A. So we'll get to them.
Yeah, there's like probably 10 or 20 chapters that touch on that in some way. I mean, even eye contact, right? Like, remember, you used to like walk into a room and everyone would kind of naturally look up. But you can walk into a subway car, you can walk into a room or into a cafe, no one looks up. They're all looking down, right? We're not seeing each other in the same way. Or take, for example, where many of us are working from home and you'll be on a Zoom with everyone. And I'll be on with my full team at work and it looks like everyone is looking at me, but of course they're not looking at me, they're looking at their screen. And for all I know, they could be editing something or they could be slacking someone or they could be doing something completely different. And not only do I not have that visual and the knowledge, like actually the person's 100% looking at me, but also I don't have the sound because people keep their mics off. And when you think about this, like, when you talk to people who teach and at the university level or even in high school, everyone has their laptop up. They're not all looking at the professor. And that's a really disconcerting thing for someone who, didn't grow up that way, to be up there lecturing, trying to connect with this room. No one is looking at them. Right. Whereas when you and I were in school, you had your notes, you took your notes by hand and you constantly looked up. In the few times that I have been in a lecture hall since the days of, everyone being on a laptop, they just the sound of people keyboarding is so distracting that I don't feel like I'm 100% there. I don't feel like I'm actually really absorbing what that lecture is. Relationships, there's so much. I'll go to one other thing, which is a chapter in the book, blind dates. So it used to be when you met someone, you met them for the first time. Now you, Ayad, we met actually in person, I think twice, once very briefly after the opening of one of your plays for like a nanosecond. And then we bumped into each other at an event for Pan America a few weeks ago. But I already knew you. How did I know you? I've interviewed you on my podcast. I've seen you in a million things online. I've seen your Twitter feed. So I know all about you. I've Googled you. I know your whole Wikipedia entry. And I already know you. So like, we actually don't even need to really meet. We've never actually had coffee or anything.
Right,
but you probably feel like you know me, but we don't know each other. And it used to be with a blind date. You didn't know anything really about the person, except that maybe your friend said, oh, this guy, he works in, marketing, and he went to college with my sister and he's supposed to be really cute and he broke up with his girlfriend like 4 months ago and now he's good. He's tall and he said he'll wear a blue sweater. That's like it. That's all you knew. But now, even if you do get set up on a blind date, and it's rare, it's not blind. You Google the hell out of someone, but you Google everyone before you meet them. You Google people before you interview them. I mean, you get so much more information. We used to be, you just had a resume. Now, in addition to the CV, you're like, you have a whole, you can look at their entire social media, their full digital presence, and you know them.
It's interesting, the way that you're framing the question or framing the matter of relationship, it makes me think about the fact there are these two kinds of knowing. There's the knowing that is like the what of a person, all of the categories that you're talking about, the things that you could learn by reading Wikipedia or whatever it may be. And then there's the who of the person, which is the thing that you're referring to, that we only got a chance to briefly experience with one another in person. Even on this kind of virtual modality, there's such a transactional nature to so much of what we're doing on Zoom. We're in a meeting for a reason, for this, for that it's hard to have that open space, that empty space that actually sort of creates the possibility for the discoveries that are about relationship.
Right. And the discoveries too that are personal to us. So like, I used to feel very sorry for anyone who was famous in any way, because I thought, well, that's really like, it must be so hard to know when you meet someone like to sort of just start from scratch like a normal person and have them base their opinion of you on what they're encountering in that space with you, in that conversation, in that interaction. But also they already feel like they know you. So there's just this like you, and you never know, is someone really like me, or they just like me for this, or what do they think about me, or do they just know about that one thing, you know, that dumb movie I was in, or whatever it might be, or how I've been typecast. But now we're all kind of like the least famous people. We're all sort of suffering from that same thing, because everyone, like, you don't have to be famous at all, you know, you could feel like you're a fairly anonymous person, but nonetheless there's many profiles and evidences of you online, and so people are not encountering you in a kind of completely open way, or an almost entirely open way, in the way that they used to. They have a lot more information, and I think that, you know, that just it's an odd thing. I think we're not still entirely used to how, you know, to handling that.
Yeah, and also because in my experience, just sort of meeting people and sort of looking at the history of that, the first impressions are so essential to that. And the felt experience of that first impression is so pivotal often in my long-term relationship with, but that's something that's hard to gauge from
Right.
the list of stuff about them.
Well, now we're no longer present for the first impression, right? Like the person has their first impression of us without us being there. So that's really weird. You know, and another way that affects things is high school reunions, which is a chapter in the book, because, you know, when you go to a high school reunion, we're all still having the same conversations, right, that we had at the 5th and the 10th reunion. Yes, because I'm an ancient person. So my numbers are now up there, but it's like, we're all going through the motions. It's like, oh my God, what are you doing? Well, you know exactly what I'm doing. Come on. Like, we all know exactly what we're doing. And it's not because anyone is more, you know, is more famous or well-known. It's just that, like, we know, we've seen it. You're all online.
Whatever it may be, right? Exactly. So there's a lot in the book about cognitive function. The thought processes of reading and writing, is getting back to the screen versus the page earlier, handwritten versus typed. So much of what you describe, I kind of intuitively get, like one of that one thing of always knowing where something is because of the geography on the page. I mean, 20 years later, I can go back to a book and I remember that it was on that side of the page and I could find the quote that way. And there's something about the brain that is processing meaning and spatially. And there's a lot of, you put language to some of these things. You also put some science to them. At one point you discuss the Baltimore County implementing a laptop per student program with physical textbooks, paper, pencils, and pens disappearing from the class, and note that one of the results was grades dropping across the board. You also quote a study in the same section of young children's brain scans as they type versus as they write freehand. There are some very real cognitive realities that are happening. Why are we not taking this stuff more seriously?
You know, and it's interesting. I mean, I could have, and I did in earlier drafts, have many more studies that establish all of this. And I ultimately, I felt like this book wasn't the place for all of that research. And there is a lot of great research in books by people like Shelley Turkle and others that look at the fact that you do acquire and retain information much better when you are looking at a piece of paper and when you are writing with a writing utensil and not, you know, as it's called now, keyboarding. Touch typing, by the way, is another thing gone. But I didn't want to dwell so much on that. But hold on, you asked me another question about learning. I've forgotten the first part of your question.
Well,
I answered in part, maybe.
Yeah, the second part was that there's so many realities we just don't seem to be taking them seriously, and
right. Okay. Yes.
The implications are really, really profound and significant. They're not just about, you know, oh, it was better when whatever.
Yes. Well, I can say that I forgot the first half of your question because my attention span and my memory are gone because of the internet.
It was admittedly a long question.
But no, absolutely. I think that, you know, now I've forgotten it again.
Why are we not taking it seriously?
Oh, why are we not taking it seriously? Well, okay, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about consumer culture. Like, again, there is such a strong marketing message, especially in schools, about skills of the 21st century, right? That is an industry phrase, okay? Like when, again, if you think about this in the most brutal economic terms, technology companies are out to make money. They try to acquire customers just like any other company tries to acquire companies, just like McDonald's. And when is the best time to acquire a customer? When they are young, and that is why there are Happy Meals. And what is very clever about, and the Times has done a lot of reporting around this, what is very clever is that they have a very powerful message that they've not only sold, that they're not only selling directly to kids, but that they've sold to school administrators and to the people who control the curriculum. And that message is that this is the learning that kids need to do. Well, who says so? The technology industry. And they say, well, technology is the future. Well, look, there are lots of futures. There is a big future in healthcare. There's a big future in elder care. There's a big future in climate. And yet we haven't tailored our curriculum towards the caring professions, towards, entirely towards preservation of environmental resources. So why are we taking this one industry and allowing that industry to dictate what the education system looks like? And they've come up with these incredibly powerful ways to acclimate kids at a very early age, not just to do lots of things online, but also very much to use their services. I mean, Chromebooks, for example, it's a very cheap laptop that is being sold by Google into classrooms so that kids become early Google users. And, what's interesting too is like, for many people, and I'm talking to the people in Seattle, I realize like all these companies are located, many of them in the cities of these books. But, Microsoft Word, to my mind, is a much better word processing technology than Google Docs. But kids today don't use Microsoft Word. Why? It's too expensive for most schools to buy the Microsoft suite. They are being sold the Google Workspace suite at a much lower rate. And so that's what all the kids are using. And again, and there are other profound implications for the ways in which kids learn. So Google Docs are shared documents, right? Anyone, once you share them with a group, anyone can go in, and they say that this is to foster collaborative work. Well, okay, collaborative work definitely has its role. There's a lot of good to collaboration. There's also a lot of good to a kid kind of being able to learn how to think and what they think by themselves. They're at a young formative age before they have to be subjected to their peers coming in to the doc and saying like, well, that's stupid, or like, delete that, change that. And it's just a different way of learning how to think. So I do think that, in the same way that social media, which we haven't really talked about that much, but kind of flattens opinions and gets more towards, I would say, consensus, but it's more like polarized groups of consensus depending on what vacuum you're in. In the same way, if you were in a Google Doc with a lot of your peers saying like, that's a dumb idea, that's a cool idea, right? You're going to tend to not put in an out there notion, not be especially creative or daring, not exert an opinion that might be unpopular. So kids are learning all that kind of thinking that we are learning on social media, or just habituating ourselves to as adults. They're learning that very early. And again, I think the reason we're not taking it seriously is because we have all, and I'm as guilty, even though there are people who resist this, obviously, but by and large, as a society and as an economy and as a nation, we have taken this industry for its word, and we're not really the kinds of discerning, skeptical consumers we are with other products and services.
A question from one of the attendees is connected to this. How do you, I think I understand, I think I know how you're going to respond to this, but I want you to respond to it. How do you feel about print on paper newspapers versus online versions? The attendee is noting that their 60-year-old New York Times subscription remains on paper.
Well, I think that there are, the New York Times website is great, and there's all kinds of story forms and all kinds of visual storytelling and video and audio and all these things that we can do. And I think that's all wonderful. But I do want to say at the same time, these things are complicated and some things are lost. One of the things that I think you lose without the print experience is that when you were reading the print newspaper and you were turning each broadsheet page by page, you were getting exposed to stories that you did not seek out. Right? Because they weren't surfaced in your social media feed, or you didn't go to that band of the internet, or they weren't on the homepage. So suddenly your eye might see like a photo from Egypt and think, that's so interesting. What's going on in Egypt? I have no idea about what's happening in Egypt. Now I'm going to stop and I'm going to read. I think that it exposes us to a broader array of information. And it's often in reading that broadsheet newspaper that you have that serendipitous. I feel like it exposes us to more than we self-select. And again, I'm going to like skip 10 steps here, but I think that leads to a more informed populace, a more engaged citizenry, and better democracy and global citizenship. Just when you are more aware of the world around you, as opposed to going online and being like, oh, what's in my newsletter that's all about, downtown Seattle, it's just, you see more in the print experience. And I could say lots of other things about the print experience. I'll say one other thing, which is that, magazines in particular, they're curated in the same way an album was curated. And that whole idea of curation, of being like, this is the entry point, this is this is where we are. It's that knowing the physical things on the page. You lose that. Like when I'm putting together the book review each week, I am thinking like, we need this kind of fiction. We need a serious history book. Let's have some works in translation here. Let's have something just fun. Let's look for a variety of authors from varied ethnic, religious, ideological, gender, political backgrounds from different countries. Let's look at reviewers from those same perspectives. And let me put together this like one whole that isn't going to cover all bases in each week. But again, you get a very different experience if you just sort of like are looking for one title online. You're not seeing that sort of full array.
Now that you bring up the New York Times Book Review, I'm sure that a lot of our guests today are curious. What's it like to be the editor of the New York Times Book Review? What is a day in the life of the New York Times Book Review editor like? And what's it like?
Well, it's great. Honestly, I love it. I love it. I feel like if I didn't love it, I shouldn't have this job, because it's such a fun job and there aren't that many jobs like this. And so if you don't love it, you should just move on, because like there are lots of people I think who, would enjoy having that opportunity. It's obviously feels like a lot of responsibility. I am aware that at any given moment, I'm upsetting like 90%, maybe 99% of the authors on the planet, either by ignoring or having some of our reviewers weigh in a negative way on their books. So I sort of assume that everyone is pissed off at me at any given moment. It's very rare to have someone who's like, yay. Gary Steingart today, he got a good review, really nice review by our critic, Molly Young. So he's happy today. And probably there's like many hundreds of people who are not happy. What's interesting about the day job during quarantine, just to get a little bit back at this idea, is that, and it's not really quarantine, but, working from home, you lose a lot when you don't have a physical book to go through. Like when you're evaluating a book for review and you have a PDF, it's a very different experience. You can't be like, how long and short are these chapters? Like, what does this feel like? Are there charts? Are there graphs? Let me get to the index. It's just, you cannot kind of conceive of the book as a whole online as well as you can with a physical book in your hands.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Just a reminder to all our guests, if you have a question for Pamela, please put it in the Q&A. I'm going to read one here. While the internet has changed our lives in many ways, do you think people are fighting to return back to how things used to be? For example, I've seen a big surge in younger people wanting to find pen pals and get back into writing physical letters. So although we are in a time where you can talk to folks online, they want to revert back to how things were. Do you think this happens because of the anxiety around how fast tech is moving?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And that's why I think, that's why I tried to look at things too, like, what is it like for the kids who never had this old tech? There are lots of forms of old technology that are having a resurgence now, like vinyl, like moleskin notebooks. There's a fetish for certain lines of, real books, like the New York Review of Books are super chic, among certain urban millennials and Gen Z readers. And there's this app called Dispo that tries to simulate the experience of having to wait to see what your film looks like. So, I mean, remember when you used to have a camera, right? You had like your little Fuji or your Kodak, and you would get like a 24 or 36 roll, and it was really expensive to buy the film, and then even more expensive to develop it. So you would take photos really sparingly. And sometimes it would be like 6 months before you went to the photo, developing store to bring it in. And then you'd have to wait a week. Now, of course, then there was 24-hour developing, but you'd have to wait a week and then you would get them back. And now there's this app that, well, you don't have to wait a week. That would be too much, but you do have to wait until 9 a.m. to see what you took the day before using this app. And it's kind of, again, to simulate for young people, like, this is what it used to be like to have to wait around for things.
Well, it's bringing the unknown back into the equation. I mean, one of the things that I often think about with regards to the sort of larger tech apparatus and how it's all constructed and how it operates is that it's functioning basically on the principle of confirming bias. Because when it confirms bias, we tend to drift or gravitate toward that thing.
Yeah.
And so the message, the deeper sort of philosophical experience of being connected all the time in that way is to constantly have some form of the world as you see it or as you would want to see it reaffirmed back to you. And
totally. I mean, I will go onto Twitter and I will be totally delighted. I'll be like, oh my God, everyone is talking about books. It's all books all the time. And then I'm like, duh, of course it's all books all the time. It's because I'm only following the book people, and that everyone else is talking about like NASCAR and Beyonce and Rihanna and, hamburgers and politics. It's just that I'm not in that room. And we are all like that. We're all in our own rooms and we all feel, and, and again, each room, of course, has its polarities. And has its vast empty middle where you cannot go, because to ever be like not in that kind of secure, self-affirming, reaffirming place of sort of pre-agreed upon, preconceived ideas and opinions is dangerous. So it's a weirdly homogenizing and flattening experience, but times a billion, because there are all these different groups that you enter in, and you, wherever you're in, it has its codes and its rules.
And it's harder to find the unknown from those places, which is, goes back to your comment about the physical paper. It's always the experience I have is whenever I get a physical copy of the paper, I read all kinds of articles that I never would have read in any other. And I think the New York Times app does a pretty good job of sort of laying out a lot of different stuff, but I tend to gravitate on that. Yeah, in that form, I tend to gravitate in that way. There's a comment here, it's a comment and a question, not to fangirl out too much, but my God, how do you do it all? The podcast, which is fantastic, by the way, the book review, writing books. I feel lucky to hold down a day job and keep myself fed.
I'm sleep deprived. I've got like bags under my eyes. I did not watch nearly enough TV. I will say that. Like I'm woefully. There was this great anecdote that David Sedaris once told, and he was in a car, I think, driving around France, and this woman said, and I remember this anecdote wrong, so I'm going to tell it my wrong way. David Sedaris has corrected me. I remember it as she saying that there were three choices, like three things in life, and it was actually four, but I don't remember them. She says there's three sort of things in your life. There's health, there's work, and there's love, and you can't have all three, so you have to give one up. And he said to her, well, what have you given up? And she said, work. It's not doing it, and she turns the question on him. And I think he says, well, I've given up on health. This is like before he quit smoking. And I think about that in terms of cultural consumption. It's like at a certain point, you have to realize, like, I'm just not going to keep on top of music. I don't know what is playing, I don't know the music. So I'm grossly neglecting my children. No, I'm kidding. I hope I'm not, but
in a connected question, if you're 16-year-old as a stand-in for today's youth, I don't know if you have a 16-year-old.
I do.
But, okay, so the attendee knows that. If your 16-year-old as a stand-in for today's youth were to review your book, what would she, they, he say?
Well, two of my three kids have read it. Interestingly, my 16-year-old daughter is not, but my 14 and my 12-year-old sons have. And he's a 14-year-old son, and he's not listening, but he said was very 14-year-old son. He was like, it was good. I liked it. And my 12-year-old found it like anthropologically fascinating. But they've also been hearing me blather on about these things quite a bit. So I don't think it was too much new news for them. They were a jaded audience.
Right. So I have one last question, which is in some ways maybe my so the thing that I was left with the most, which is I was particularly touched by the section toward the end called humility, which struck me as really spot on about something that's going on in the culture that's been going on for some time, which is really quite profound. I'm going to ask you to describe what it is, but my question, and then I can repeat it if it slips out of your mind for whatever. The section and some of the things that you say in that section point the way to a new kind of social behavior that we're encouraging, and that it turns out in a way that the technology and the commerce is driving fundamental values in our system. And it's of course alarming, but let's put the alarming part of it aside. Let's just sort of talk about what it is and what it is that you say about it.
Yeah, I mean, there is humiliation. And I don't know if it's in this chapter or in another chapter where I say the internet comes for us all one day. I really believe that. And, there have been studies that have shown, and the technology companies know this, and we obviously see the results in our politics, that people gravitate online towards negativity. They are drawn by anger and by negative tweets, posts, all of that. Instagram kind of looks happy, but I think there's also some sadness that lies beneath. And again, there are some good things to all these social media. So I'm not saying like they're all horrible, but I am going to focus on the losses. So you do see when someone slips up, makes a mistake, does something wrong, embarrasses themselves, humiliates themselves. It's on a grand scale because everyone is watching and everyone piles on. And if you try to defend the person who is being piled on, you will be piled on too. And it's like a kind of schoolyard bullying writ large, and it's horrible for adults, and it's unimaginably awful for kids. Like, you do one embarrassing thing, like think about just like a typical, like, let's even say like low-lying embarrassment of high school, where you walk out of the bathroom and you've got toilet paper on the bottom of your shoe, right? And so, but now everyone has like a little internet in their hands, and they can photograph it and they can make a meme out of it and they can post it online, and you could know nothing about it. It's not just like three kids in the hallway who are going to be like, it can become a whole thing. It can metastasize. Even things that, aren't necessarily humiliating can become humiliating when people who like to think of their daily lives as being still somewhat their own, somewhat private, have something blown up. Like there was that guy, I can't remember what big box store he worked at, but he was just a checkout guy. And like someone took a photo of him or a video, and it just metastasized online until he was like this hero of the working, sort of retail, like daily worker class. And everyone made a huge deal out of him. And he was like briefly extraordinarily famous. And it was very uncomfortable for him. Like he did not choose to be in this position. So I think, I'm not sure if that's totally getting at the humiliation aspect, but I certainly think that each of us could easily come up with one grotesquely or 20 grotesquely humiliating things that have happened to us online. And it might just be as simple as like a reply all or an autofill in an email that you're just like, oh my God, I just sent this thing to the person who I was talking about. And I sent it to him instead of to like whatever it might be. Like we're just all constantly humiliated, embarrassed, but it's on an internet wide scale.
Well, it was humiliation, but also the section I was talking about was humility.
Oh, humility.
That was the one that really.
Oh my God, yes. Oh, okay, no, humility.
It really went to the question of fundamental values and how you orient yourself in life.
Yes, I mean, yes, humility. So that is a totally different question. I will try to answer it very briefly.
Your answer to the other one was good too. So
I'm only answering things that begin with HUMIL. Humility is, and this again is aided and abetted by social media. It's like we're all meant to kind of show off our best side all the time. Like, why would you show your worst? I do think that the internet is turning us all into reality TV stars in some way, in which, and it's really hard not to do it, right? It's so hard. It's hard as a parent. It's really hard to be like, oh my God, my kid is doing the cutest, coolest, funnest little thing, and I'm just gonna snapshot it, I'm gonna post it, and then you're like, wait, like I'm like, if I do that, I am that parent. I am that parent who's like, look at the A my child got, or whatever it might be. It's odd. It's like we're all turning into very performative and outward facing people. And I also think, part of humility is acknowledging the idea that you might be wrong, right? And it's harder to admit to mistakes online. You can get excoriated for the mistake itself, not for the fact that you were admitting to it and owning up to it and saying, I was wrong about this. You could just get, everything is kind of is sort of clipped. And so I think people are very careful. I've answered like 10 questions there.
You've answered them all wonderfully. Folks, the book is called 100 Things We've Lost to the Internet. It's written by Pamela Paul. And thank you, Pamela. This has been a delight. Thank you to Powell's and to Third Place.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everyone who is here and for your questions and comments. And Ayad, thank you.
Oh my God.
Great questions.
Ayad and Pamela, thank you so much. And to everyone at home, thanks for tuning in tonight. I'm going to post the link to Pamela's book in the chat one more time. So go ahead and click on that. Spencer, I believe you have a link to your store as well. There you go. So if you're in Seattle or Portland, you can order that depending on who your home team bookstore is. And I'm also going to post a link in the chat for our YouTube page. And this event will be popping up there probably tomorrow afternoon. So if you know somebody who would want to watch it, you can direct them to that link to watch it tomorrow. And Pamela?
Yeah, I want to give a little plug for Ayad's last novel, Homeland Elegies, which was also, you didn't mention, one of the 10 best books of the year. There's the little emblem for the New York Times Book Review. It's an excellent book, so I highly recommend.
It is great. And Pamela's book right here. All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. Spencer, any last words?
That's it. Yeah, have a great night, everyone. On behalf of Third Place Books, it was so wonderful to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
Bye.
good night.